Hi everyone. Emancipation of Black slaves in the United States. Before we talk about the liberation or emancipation of Black slaves in the United States, there is a question we must ask ourselves. Was the emancipation of the slaves the reason for the Civil War? To understand the origin of the Civil War, we must see it from a social, political, but also economical point of view. A common explanation is that the Civil War was fought over the moral issue of slavery. In fact, it was the economics of slavery and political control of that system that was central to the conflict. While others argue that the cause of the Civil War was slavery, sectionalism, and secession, but in this type of work, we will concentrate mostly on the emancipation of Black slaves. Right now, no one doubts that the abolition of slavery or the emancipation of Black slaves is an important part of the history of the United States. Therefore, to understand the emancipation of Black slaves, we must put this type of work from a historical context. Slavery in the United States refers to the legal institution that existed in the United States of America during the 18th and 19th century. Slavery was practiced in British America from the beginning of the colonial era and was firmly established when the United States Declaration of Independence was signed. President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. As the nation approached its third year of bloody civil war, the proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforth shall be free. Although Lincoln had announced the Emancipation Proclamation 2 years earlier, freedom did not come for most African Americans until the victory of the Union in April 1865, and officially in December 1865, with the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified on December 6, 1865, and officially made slavery illegal in all states. African Americans could no longer be held as slaves and were free to live their lives as people and not as property. To understand the history of the United States, we must know when and why slavery began in all the British colonies in America. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, people were abducted from the African continent, forced into slavery in the American colonies, and exploited to work as servants and laborers in the production of crops such as tobacco and cotton. In the 19th century, America's westward expansion and abolition movement sparked a major debate about slavery that would tear the nation apart in bloody civil war, resulting in the end of slavery in the United States and America. In the 18th century, the slave trade became a profitable economic activity for such port cities as Bristol, Liverpool, and Glasgow, engaged in the so-called triangular trade. Merchant ships set out for Britain, loaded with trade goods which were exchanged on the West African shores for slaves captured by local rulers from deeper inland. The slaves were transported through the infamous Middle Passage across the Atlantic and were sold at considerable profit for labor in plantations. The ships were loaded with export crops and commodities, the products of slave labor such as cotton, sugar, and rum, and returned to Britain to sell the items. Historians and economists have debated the economic effects of slavery for Great Britain and the North American colonies. Some analysts, such as Eric Williams, suggest that it allowed the formation of the capital and financed the Industrial Revolution. Although the evidence is inconclusive, slave labor was integral to the early settlement of the colonies, which needed more people for labor and other work. Also, slave labor produced the major consumer goods that were the basis of world trade during the 18th century and early 19th centuries: coffee, cotton, rum, sugar, and tobacco. Slavery was far more important to the profitability of plantations and the economy in the American South. And the slave trade and associated business were important to both New York and New England. As a consequence of the transatlantic slave trade, 12 million Africans were sent to America between the 16th and 19th centuries to meet the need for workers in the Spanish, French, Portuguese, and British colonies. Of these, an estimated 645,000 were sent to what is known today as the United States. The largest number was transported to the Caribbean and Brazil, where life expectancy was short and slaves had to be constantly replaced. Life expectancy was much higher in the United States, generally because of better food, less illness, less work, and better healthcare. So the numbers grew rapidly, with births exceeding deaths. The slave population in the United States had grown to 4 million according to the 1860 census. It must be taken into account that within the operations produced by the slave owners, there was also the obligation of procreation among slaves by their owners, reasons for which in many southern plantations, there were large breeding places for black. Those arose from the idea that a strong woman with a strong man gave birth to a strong black child, a new slave, practiced on large black slave plantations which exploited the womb of black women for the economic benefit of slave owners. Most of the slaves were owned by plantation owners, who defined by historians as having 20 or more slaves. 95% of black people lived in the South, representing a third of the population of that region. By comparison, in the North, black people only represented 2% of its population. Slave labor was a major factor in the accumulation of wealth in the United States in the first half of the 19th century. On January 13, 1777, Prince Hall and 7 other black men petitioned the Massachusetts General Court on behalf of a great number of Negroes, insisted that they had no natural and inalienable right to liberty. The petition demonstrated that black people in different parts of New England asserted an African identity during the American Revolution. Historians generally note this trend with African churches and societies at the turn of the century. In the mid-1780s, a complex mix of addressing blacks in the colony and then state authorities, bringing slaves to lawsuits against the entire institution of slavery, and a rise in private manumissions scuttled with the future of slavery in Massachusetts. Britain's colonial breakup did not end slavery in the southern states. Emancipation in the northern states came slowly and with great hesitation, even fear. On the other hand, abolition compensated northern slave owners who did not guarantee citizenship to free blacks, and at least partially, they gave rise to a movement that sent free blacks to Africa. In 1787, when nearly 300,000 people of African descent populated every state in the new nation, many leaders hoped that slavery would decline, as George Washington put it, by degrees, slowly, surely, and imperceptibly. The hope was vain. Finally, of course, slavery ended, but the cost of the delay was horrible. The document the Founding Fathers created co-signed millions of human beings to chattel servitude. In the 78 years between the writing of the Constitution and the end of the Civil War, the United States became the preeminent slave-owning nation in the world, with the largest quota population of emancipation, 3.9 million, than any other in history. Slavery itself was never widespread in the North, although many of the region's businessmen grew rich from slave trade and investments in southern plantations. Between 1774 and 1804, all the northern states abolished slavery, but the institution of slavery remained absolutely vital to the South. Historian James M. McPherson defines an abolitionist as someone who prior to the Civil War had agitated for the immediate, unconstitutional, and total abolition of slavery in the United States. He does not include anti-slavery activists like Abraham Lincoln or the Republican Party, which called for a gradual end to slavery. Benjamin Franklin, a slave owner for much of his life, became a prominent member of the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery, the first recognized organization for abolitionists in the United States. After the American Revolutionary War, the northern states abolished slavery, beginning with the Vermont Constitution of 1777, followed by the Pennsylvania Gradual Emancipation Act in 1780. Other states with a greater economic interest in slaves, such as New York and New Jersey, also passed gradual emancipation laws, and by 1804, all northern states had abolished it. Although this did not mean that existing slaves were freed. Some had to work without pay as indentured servants for another 2 decades, although they could no longer be sold. Also, in the years after the Revolution, individual slave owners, especially in the Upper South, manumitted slaves, sometimes at their will. In the Deep South, manumission became difficult. In South Carolina, all manumission required legislative approval, and freed slaves had to leave the state immediately. Many noted that they had been moved by the revolutionary ideas of the equality of men. The number of free blacks as a proportion of the black population increased from less than 1% to nearly 10% from 1790 to 1810 in the Upper South as a result of these actions. Although the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery in the nation, it captured the hearts and imaginations of millions of Americans and fundamentally transformed the character of the war. After January 1st, 1863, each advance of federal troops expanded liberty's domain. Additionally, the proclamation announced the acceptance of black men into the Union Army and Navy, allowing those free to become liberators by the end of the war. Nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors had fought for the Union and freedom. In 1793, Congress passed the legislation to enforce the fugitive slave provision of the Constitution, which guarantees slave owners the right to claim their human property on the soil of free states. When Northern consciences resisted the measure of subsequent decades, Congregation passed the notorious Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which historian Eric Foner has labeled the most powerful exercise of federal authority in the United States in the entire era before the Civil War. After the Revolution, this intertwining of African and American identities with threads of revolutionary ideals was fragile and sometimes controversial. During the early Republic, blacks organized African self-help societies and churches, and in the face of intensifying hostility from some efforts to get out of Africa, they also embraced emerging American values of education and enterprise, and joined a wider public sphere despite increasingly violent racism. On January 1st, 1808, at St. Thomas African Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, the Reverend Absalom Jones gave this Thanksgiving sermon for the abolition of the African slave trade. Scholars have explained how Lincoln could emancipate the slaves less for his own good than for the good of the nation. Yet, paradoxically, Lincoln's nation was also a nation of the slave. To understand the situation of the slaves in the 1850s, when the slave code was established which prohibited enslaved blacks from engaging in behaviors and activities that negatively affected the white population, such as disrespecting whites, trespassing on white property, marrying or cohabitating with free blacks, eloping, producing forged papers, renting out of themselves, hunting with a gun, and preaching at a prayer meeting where enslaved people of different masters met. Freed people were not allowed to carry guns, to testify against whites in court, or to compete in business on an equal basis with whites. Something we must understand, Abraham Lincoln's Slave Emancipation Proclamation after the Civil War on January 1st, 1863, which declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforth shall be free. It was an important step in the life of the slave population. But what really created the basis of the integration of blacks into North American society was the approval by the Senate on July 9th, 1868. The Fourth Amendment granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including formerly enslaved people, and providing all citizens with equal protection under the laws. Was the emancipation of slaves the path to racial equality between blacks and whites in the United States? From my point of view, no. When you analyze the implementation of Jim Crow laws, racial segregation, and anti-mixed race laws, that tells you that there is still a long way to go. Some historians claim that the bodies of black slaves were freed, but not their minds. Blacks were emancipated, but never really liberated, and are still less than humane in some sectors of American society. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your interest in this type of work.